I'm Dick, 42, and today I feel like I made a colossal mistake at work. It all started this morning when I skipped breakfast, my first bad decision of the day. By 10 a.m., my stomach was growling and I found myself wandering into the break room in search of anything to keep me going until lunch. That's when I spotted a pink box on the counter filled with a dozen beautifully decorated cupcakes. They looked incredible, frosted in pastel blues and pinks with sprinkles and little decorations on top. I didn't see any signs or notes. And around here, if food's left in the break room, it's usually up for grabs. So, I figured someone had brought them in for the office, and I dug in. They were the best cupcakes I've ever had. I devoured 4 of them without even realizing it. I was on the last one, licking the frosting off my fingers when a woman walked into the room. She looked at me, then at the somewhat lighter box, and back at me with horror. "Did you eat a cupcake?" she asked, her voice tight. I sheepishly held up 4 fingers, trying to smile but knowing I'd probably overdone it. She let out a strangled breath. "Oh no," she whispered, looking stricken. Before I could ask what was wrong, the door swung open and a whole crowd of women poured in, each carrying gift bags and balloons. At the center of the group was a very pregnant woman, waddling in with a big smile on her face. "It's baby shower time," someone called out cheerfully. The woman who caught me in the act looked like she wanted to disappear. She turned to me, eyes blazing. "You just ate the snacks for the shower," she hissed, barely keeping her voice low enough not to attract the attention of the rest of the group. "Now what am I going to do?" My face got hot. I had no idea. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't know. I just thought they were for the office." "Do you always eat things that no one told you were up for grabs? Only when they're left on the break room counter. I thought they were for everyone." "They were," she snapped. "Everyone at the shower." She pulled a few of her friends aside, and after some whispered conversations and disappointed glances in my direction, 3 women reluctantly agreed to split 2 cupcakes without making a fuss. She told them she'd explain later. They nodded, visibly bummed but agreeing to make do. Then she turned back to me, clearly at her wit's end. "You may go," she said, waving me off like I was a kid who'd just been scolded. I felt like an idiot, dismissed from the room as everyone else moved on with the celebration, minus their cupcakes. I genuinely didn't mean any harm. I just thought the cupcakes were there for anyone who needed a snack. But now I feel like I ruined the baby shower snack situation. And I'm not sure if I'm the bad guy for assuming or if it was just a major misunderstanding. So, am I the asshole for eating the cupcakes, or was it an honest mistake?
Now we get Elaine's side of the story. Today was supposed to be a simple, fun day at the office. My boss, Mrs. Aldridge, had asked me to organize a small baby shower for one of our coworkers. Mrs. Aldridge isn't exactly a warm and fuzzy type. Everyone in the office calls her the ice queen behind her back. She's cold, unforgiving, and expects absolute perfection in everything. She has this severe bun that pulls her hair so tight it looks painful, and a permanent pinched expression that makes you feel like you've already done something wrong before you even speak to her. She's the type who'll cut you down with one icy glare, and there's no reasoning with her when she's made up her mind. I'd been out earlier in the morning to pick up a dozen cupcakes from the best bakery in town. I'd splurged on them with the company card because Mrs. Aldridge insisted everything had to be top-notch for these little events. Nothing cheap, nothing out of place. I put the box in the break room, thinking it would be safe for an hour until the shower started. When the time came, I walked in with everyone else, ready to celebrate. That's when I saw him, Dick, standing there with frosting on his lips and a guilty look on his face. My stomach dropped as I looked at the box and saw that 4 cupcakes were gone. 4. Dick sheepishly admitted to eating them, thinking they were just for the office. I was furious, but there was nothing I could do at that point. The pregnant guest of honor walked in, and the party had to go on. I scrambled, quietly asking a few of my coworkers to go without a cupcake. 2 people even agreed to split theirs, just to keep things smooth. I hated putting everyone in that position, but they were understanding. We all knew Mrs. Aldridge wouldn't take the truth lightly, and I didn't want to drag Dick into the mess he'd created. So I covered for him, saying I'd made a mistake, realized too late, and hadn't gotten enough cupcakes. After the shower, Mrs. Aldridge called me into her office. She sat behind her desk, cold and unforgiving as always. The office was sterile, much like her personality. No personal touches, just files stacked neatly and everything in its place. She eyed me from behind her thin-framed glasses. Her lips pursed like she was biting into a lemon. "Elaine," she began, her voice as frosty as her reputation. "I asked you to handle one simple task, 12 cupcakes. I'm told there were only 8. I swallowed hard, keeping my gaze on the floor. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Aldridge. I must have miscounted when I ordered them. I realized too late and I tried to make do." Her eyes narrowed, her mouth curling into a faint sneer. "Miscounted? This is a simple task, Elaine. Simple, and you failed. Do you know how this reflects on me? You had one job today and you couldn't even manage that." I took the berating quietly, knowing that anything I said would only make it worse. She tore into me for another few minutes, each word sharp and cutting, before finally dismissing me with a wave of her hand, like I was an annoying bug she wanted to swat away. I walked back to my desk, biting my tongue to keep from crying or screaming, anything that would give her the satisfaction of knowing she got to me. When I got to my desk, there was a small pink box sitting on it. I opened it and saw 4 cupcakes inside, the exact number Dick had eaten. On top was a note that simply said, "Sorry." Anger bubbled up in me all over again. I grabbed the box and stormed through the office, going from cubicle to cubicle until I found him sitting at his desk, looking sheepish as ever. I slammed the box down in front of him, making him jump. "Too late," I snapped. "She's pissed. So, enjoy your stupid cupcakes. Thanks, but no thanks. I hope you choke on them." I turned and walked away, leaving him staring after me, mouth open but no words coming out. I'm not sure what I expected. A real apology, maybe? Something more than just throwing cupcakes back in my face after I'd just been ripped apart by the Ice Queen for his screw-up? But it's too late now. I did what I could to keep the peace, and in the end, I was the one who paid the price. I hope next time he thinks twice before stuffing his face with things that aren't his.
My head was still spinning from Elaine's eruption in the office. She'd slammed those cupcakes down in front of me, seething with anger, and told me to choke on them. It was clear I'd messed up worse than I realized, and I couldn't get her words out of my head. When lunchtime rolled around, I couldn't even think about food. I just needed some air, so I blindly stumbled toward the stairwell, heading for my car where I could try to clear my thoughts. But as I descended the stairs, I caught sight of Elaine sitting on the bottom step, wiping at her eyes. She tried to hide that she was crying, but it was obvious. Her face was splotchy and her eyelashes were stuck together. I hesitated, not sure if I should just keep walking and leave her alone, but something pulled me to her. I sat down beside her without saying anything, reaching into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulling out a handkerchief. I held it out to her. "It's clean," I said when she hesitated, looking at the neatly folded cloth like it was a foreign object. "Clean your face up. If she sees you like this, she wins." She stared at the handkerchief, then at me, confused. "Why do you have a cloth handkerchief in your pocket?" she asked, her voice thick with tears. I shrugged, feeling a mix of embarrassment and nostalgia. "My grandfather always told me I should carry one because you never know when you'll get to be a hero and offer it to a crying woman." I thought he was shitting me, but every year he gave me a set of monogrammed handkerchiefs for Christmas. I carry them mainly because I miss him. He died last year. She blew her nose loudly into the handkerchief, catching me off guard. I blinked at her, a little stunned. "I'm going to want that back," I said, half joking, though I was serious, since he gave it to me. She held it out to me, snot and all. I grimaced, resisting the urge to recoil. "I can wash it," she suggested, her tone lightening just a little. "That might be best," I agreed, feeling a small smile tug at my lips despite the awkwardness. We sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything still hanging between us. I bumped her shoulder gently with mine, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm sorry I ate your cupcakes." Elaine sighed. "I got in trouble for only buying 8, she said, holding up the handkerchief like it explained everything. Hence the snot. My stomach twisted with guilt. "You did?" She nodded, her expression pained. She continued, "I didn't want anyone else to get in trouble, so I told her I bought the wrong number and that it was my mistake. So, she stared at me with that disappointed look she does, worse than yelling, by the way, and told me to go away and be incompetent somewhere else." "All this over some cupcakes?" I asked, feeling the absurdity of the whole situation settle in. She nodded, and I could see the exhaustion on her face. I apologized again, genuinely sorry this time, and stood up, leaving her on the stairwell. I went back upstairs, grabbed the 4 cupcakes off my desk, the ones she'd thrown at me in frustration, and walked to the manager's office. I knocked on the door frame, and she looked up, clearly still irritated. Or perhaps that was her normal face. I had no idea, but I knew it wasn't welcoming. A courier just brought these over, I said, holding up the box. Apparently, the bakery realized they made a mistake and wanted to make it right. They said the woman who ordered them clearly said 12, but they only gave her 8. There's a new guy still in training and he messed up. They also said you can come and get a free dozen in the future to make up for it. The pinched-faced manager stared at the box, and I watched a flash of guilt cross her face before she quickly masked it. She didn't say anything, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind. What Elaine and everyone else at this branch didn't know was that I'm not just some random guy who shows up occasionally. I actually own the company. Normally, I work out of the corporate office, but I like to visit our various locations, grab an empty cubicle, and blend in. It's the best way I've found to get a real sense of how things are going. I get to see how my employees interact, what problems they face, and how our management is performing when they don't know the boss is watching. Today had been an eye-opener, to say the least. There was definitely a staffing problem here, but it wasn't Elaine or the lack of cupcakes. It was Mrs. Aldridge, the so-called Ice Queen, whose cold, relentless demeanor was crushing morale and creating a toxic environment. I'd seen the fear and frustration in my employees' eyes, and it wasn't something I could ignore any longer. Her attitude was clearly affecting everyone, and Elaine's tears were just the latest example of how badly things had gotten out of hand. I realized then and there that if things were going to change, I would have to be the one to make it happen. Mrs. Aldridge would have to go, and it was up to me to ensure it. She might have gotten away with her icy management style for a while, but now that I'd seen the impact firsthand, I knew I couldn't let it continue. I had come in today just to get a feel for how this branch was running, but I was leaving with a much clearer picture of what needed to be fixed. And the first thing on my list would be finding a new manager, someone who didn't make their employees cry over cupcakes. Elaine deserved better. They all did. And it was time for me to step up and make sure they got it.
Elaine's perspective, the morning after. The next morning I was trying to get back into my usual routine, but my head was still buzzing from everything that had happened the day before. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when Marie, my coworker, stuck her head into my cubicle, eyes wide with excitement. "Did you hear what's happening?" "Oh my God, I can't believe it," she whispered, practically bouncing on her toes. "No, what happened?" I asked, spinning my chair to face her. Marie looked like she could barely contain herself. "The owner of the company is here. He brought HR with him and they're interviewing everyone. The Ice Queen has been moved to the corporate office, no longer in a management role." My jaw dropped. Marie was practically dancing in front of me, unable to hide her glee. "Holy shit," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What caused all that?" Marie shrugged, grinning from ear to ear. "Who knows? But I think someone finally figured out what a nightmare she was." I nodded, still reeling. I never expected anything like this. Mrs. Aldridge had been a fixture here, ruling with her cold demeanor and unforgiving nature. To think she was no longer in charge felt surreal, like the office might finally be able to breathe again. As I tried to process it all, my name was called, and I was told to go to the conference room. My heart pounded as I made my way there, wondering what this was about. The second I stepped inside, I froze. Sitting at the head of the table was Dick, the man I just chewed out over cupcakes, surrounded by a group of people from HR. He looked up at me with a calm, composed expression. "Please take a seat," he said kindly, gesturing to the chair across from him. I sat down slowly, my mind racing. What was going on? Why was Dick here, sitting like he was in charge of something? He began asking me questions, and I realized he wasn't here for small talk. He wanted to know everything, the inner workings of our office, the culture, the staff dynamics, and most importantly, about Mrs. Aldridge. I answered carefully, keeping my responses honest but diplomatic. I didn't want to throw anyone under the bus. I explained that Mrs. Aldridge was strict, that she demanded a lot, and that her management style was challenging. I even mentioned the positives. She was efficient, detail-oriented, and never missed a deadline. But I also gently pointed out that her approach often left people feeling overwhelmed and undervalued. Dick listened intently, nodding along and occasionally jotting down notes. The HR team watched quietly, taking in every word I said. I kept waiting for Dick to start grilling me about the cupcakes, but he never did. Instead, he just asked questions about the team, about morale, and what I thought could make things better. "Do you work in HR?" I finally asked, unable to keep my curiosity at bay. One of the men sitting next to him snickered, quickly smothering it with a cough when Dick shot him a quelling glance. Dick turned back to me, his expression softening. "Something like that," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice but offering no further explanation. I left the meeting still feeling like I'd missed something important, but one thing was clear. Changes were coming, and whatever role Dick played in all of this, he was taking it seriously. The Ice Queen was gone, and the office already felt different, lighter, less tense. As I returned to my desk, I couldn't help but wonder what other surprises were in store. Whatever was happening, one thing was certain. The company was getting a fresh start, and maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to get better.
I'd been spending the week at this particular location, keeping a low profile and working to sort out the mess Mrs. Aldridge had created. Things were moving in the right direction, but it was taking longer than I'd hoped. I'd been sitting in the conference room sorting through resumes and reviewing feedback from the HR team when the door opened without warning. My grandmother walked in, all 5 feet of her, with that thin frame that belied her infinite strength. She'd been the backbone of our family's company for decades, building it alongside my grandfather, and while she deferred to me now in the day-to-day operations, she was still actively involved. Since my grandfather's death, she'd rallied, throwing herself back into the business with the kind of quiet determination that made her both deeply respected and occasionally feared. She walked straight up to me, kissed my forehead, and took the seat beside me.
Why have you been holed up here all week, sweetheart? I thought you had other locations to visit.
I'm trying to sort things out, I said, not hiding my frustration. This place has some real issues, and Mrs. Aldridge was just the start. I've been talking to people, trying to get a sense of who could step up and lead. I paused, reflecting on the last few days. I think I've found someone.
The Ice Queen was long overdue for a change. That woman was never fit for management. Now, what else do you think this place needs?
We spent a while discussing other changes that could improve morale. My grandmother had plenty of ideas. She wanted flexible work schedules. She suggested implementing flexible work hours to help employees balance their personal lives, especially for those with kids.
You're running a company, not a military camp. People work better when they're not chained to a desk from 9 to 5.
She felt we need recognition programs. She wanted to see more acknowledgement of hard work. A monthly award, public recognition, or even a simple thank you note could go a long way.
Your grandfather and I used to know every single employee by name. It's not about the award, it's about being seen.
She also thought we needed an open-door policy, encouraging a more open culture where employees felt safe to voice their concerns without fear of retribution.
If they're scared to talk, then you're doing it wrong. People should never dread coming to work.
We were deep in conversation when a soft knock interrupted us. I looked up and there was Elaine, standing hesitantly in the doorway, holding something in her hands. My grandmother fell silent, her gaze sharpening with interest as Elaine stepped inside.
I just wanted to return this to you,
Elaine said, holding up the neatly cleaned, folded, and pressed handkerchief I'd given her in the stairwell when I'd found her crying. I took it from her, feeling the crispness of the fabric, now scented faintly of tropical lemon. "Thank you."
Thank you.
She retorted, her tone layered with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. She turned and left the room, the soft scent of citrus lingering behind her. I glanced over at my grandmother, and to my surprise, she was blinking back tears. "What's wrong?" I asked, alarmed. She looked at me, her eyes glistening.
You loaned her your handkerchief. Did your grandfather ever tell you how we met?
I shook my head. No, he never did. She took a deep breath, her voice thick with nostalgia.
I was at a family function, a dinner party. Your grandfather was a friend of my brother's, and he was there too. My father was a harsh man, and he'd said something biting that made me cry. I stepped outside, embarrassed, and your grandfather followed. He didn't say a word, just pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket and handed it to me. I laughed through my tears and said, "My hero." And he was. For 55 years, he was my hero. That's why he gave you those handkerchiefs every year, Dick. It all started with a simple act of kindness. I don't think you ever knew that.
I was stunned. I'd never heard this story before, never known why my grandfather had insisted on those handkerchiefs all those years. My grandmother reached over, gently taking my chin in her hand, forcing me to look at her.
If you don't ask that girl out, I'll do it for you.
I laughed, shaking my head. "I don't have time to date, Grandma."
Make time.
She insisted, her voice firm. She gestured to the office around us.
All this? It's inconsequential. Love and family are the only things that truly matter in the grand scheme of things. Don't forget that.
I didn't ask Elaine out, not then at least. But a few weeks later, at our next big family party, there she was, looking as surprised as I felt. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. Elaine stumbled over her words, glancing nervously around the room.
Your grandmother invited me.
Of course she did. My grandmother had plans for everyone, it seemed. And maybe, just maybe, it was time I started making some of my own.
When I walked into the garden, the last person I expected to see was Dick. He didn't look happy to see me. That much was obvious. In the past 2 weeks, I had taken over the management of the office staff at work at HR's request, and things had been going really well, or so I thought. I spotted him standing off to the side, drink in hand, watching the crowd with an expression that was hard to read.
What are you doing here?
He asked, approaching me like I was a bomb that could go off any second. I wasn't sure if he was annoyed or just caught off guard by my presence. I set my drink down, suddenly feeling out of place. Do you want me to leave? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. I thought I'd been invited because my work was appreciated, but maybe that wasn't the case. He stared at me, his face hardening for a moment.
No.
He said curtly, nothing more, nothing less, but his gaze lingered, making me feel small and awkward. Your boss told me that all the executives would be here and that my presence was wanted, I said defensively, feeling embarrassed. It was the truth. She'd been kind, warm, and insistent that I join. But as soon as I saw Dick's expression, I realized I might have made a mistake. Dick took a deep breath, and I saw him mutter something under his breath.
My grandmother's meddling,
He said with a little growl. I blinked, realization hitting me like a ton of bricks. His grandmother was the boss, the one who had invited me. And if that was true, then Dick wasn't just some high-up executive who occasionally visited the branches. He owned the whole damn company. I felt my stomach drop as I remembered the time I'd angrily told him I hoped he choked on some cupcakes. Great. Just great. Mortified, I tried to mask my shock, but all I could do was stand there, unsure of what to say.
I grew up with a lot of responsibility. I never had much time for anything outside of work, and I've never really dated.
He seemed more frustrated than anything, but I couldn't quite figure out why he was unloading all of this now. Who said anything about dating? How dare you? I snapped, my temper flaring as I tried to cover my embarrassment. I hadn't meant to raise my voice, but it was too late. People were turning to look at us, and I could feel my face heating up. Dick grabbed my hand, pulling me away from the crowd, out of the garden, and into the house. What are you doing? I hissed, trying to yank my hand free, but his grip was strong. Everyone was watching, including his grandmother, who was smiling in a way that made me even more self-conscious.
Would you be quiet? It's not that I don't want to date you. I just don't date. Grandma knows this.
He sounded more frustrated with the situation than with me, but it didn't make me feel any better. You seriously think I'm here because I want to date you? He looked genuinely surprised, like he hadn't considered anything else.
Why does the idea of dating me seem so abhorrent? You talk about it like it's comparable to getting a root canal, Elaine.
Before I could retort, his grandmother's voice floated into the room.
Is everything okay in here?
She asked, stepping in with that same amused smile.
Fine.
Dick said quickly, glaring at her, but she met his gaze head-on, unfazed. She wagged a finger at him, scolding him like a naughty child.
Play nice, kids.
She said, clearly enjoying herself before spinning on her heel and returning to the garden. She just told us to play nice. I snorted, covering my mouth in shock. I'd never snorted in public, but I couldn't stop myself.
You just snorted.
Dick was already chuckling, shaking his head. Just when I start to like you, you say something stupid and I remember why I don't.
I thought it was my bald spot.
He said, feigning offense. I like bald spots. I blurted, my face turning a shade of red I didn't think was possible.
You do?
He grinned, a genuine smile lighting up his face. I nodded, feeling more vulnerable than I had in a long time. I do.
Well then.
He said, his smile growing wider, and for the first time I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was more to this unlikely partnership than either of us had ever realized.
Grandmother's perspective, the final matchmaking update. The past few months had been a whirlwind, and I knew from the start that my grandson, Dick, needed a little push. After years of watching him bury himself in work, convinced that he had no time for anything else, I decided it was time for him to slow down and maybe, just maybe, find the one thing his life was missing. So, I'd made him stay at that one particular location for 2 months, and I stayed with him, determined to see my plan through. I did everything I could to keep throwing Dick and Elaine together. I scheduled long meetings that conveniently required both of them. I arranged office outings that made them carpool, with me conveniently taking another vehicle so they'd have time alone. and I always found reasons to ask Elaine for help on projects Dick was managing, making sure they had plenty of excuses to spend time in close proximity. I watched as the two of them slowly went from casual interest to undeniable attraction, and then to something deeper, something they couldn't quite hide, no matter how hard they tried. But I knew. I could see it in the way Elaine looked at him, unafraid of his position, money, or power. She saw Dick for who he truly was, and I could tell that he found in her someone who matched his strength but softened his gruffness. She was the balance he didn't know he needed. I watched them fall in love, and I knew exactly what they found in each other. Dick had always been all business, but Elaine brought out a side of him that I hadn't seen since he was a boy, a softness, a lightness that had been missing for so long. They tried to keep it under wraps at first, sneaking glances when they thought no one was looking, finding small moments to be near each other. But I knew what they had, and I was just grateful I'd been there to witness it. And now, as the wedding march starts and everyone rises, I feel a swell of emotion I haven't felt in years. Dick comes over to take my arm, guiding me to my seat before he takes his place at the altar. My eyes fill with tears, and I see him reach into his pocket, pulling out one of his handkerchiefs, the ones his grandfather had given him every year. But I gently push his hand away. Clutched in my palm is a worn handkerchief, yellowed with time, tears, and memories. "This is the first one he ever gave me," I whisper, my voice breaking. My mind flashes back to that night when his grandfather had first handed it to me, offering silent comfort that had changed my life forever. Dick gives me a gentle squeeze before stepping up to the altar to wait for Elaine. I see him swipe at his own tears, trying to hold it together, but his eyes never leave the end of the aisle. When Elaine appears, radiant and glowing, I see the way his breath catches, the way his shoulders lift as if the weight of the world has been lifted. As she reaches him, he leans in, barely able to speak.
"Do you need this?"
he asks, offering the same handkerchief he'd tried to give me. Elaine smiles, her eyes wet with tears, and she reaches out, taking it.
My hero!
She whispers, echoing the words I'd once spoken so many years ago, and uses it to wipe his face. As I watch the two of them stand together, ready to start this next chapter, I can't help but think back to that day in the office, when Dick ate those cursed cupcakes left on the counter in the break room. Was he the asshole for eating them? Probably. But would he do it all over again if given the chance? I knew the answer as well as I knew my own name. Absolutely. Because sometimes it's the little mistakes that lead us exactly where we need to be.
Thanks so much for listening to today's story. If you enjoyed it, be sure to give this video a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out on our daily stories. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this Am I the Asshole? So what do you think about this situation? Drop a comment below. Do you think they were in the right or wrong? Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.